In the summer of 1969, on a rain-swept farm in upstate New York, there was a phenomenon called the Woodstock Music Festival.
Now, there have been a lot of things going on with all these elements conspiring, like the sticky mud wiggling between our toes and the drippy rain rolling down our neck. But it's all part of the high, because it glues us all together, because we're all in this same puddle. And we can work it out. We can make it groovy.
How are you out there? Are you okay?
Soggy!
Woo!
Cold and wet, but having a good time.
You're not, you're staying stoned and you got enough water and you got a place to sleep and everything?
No!
What does that mean?
If you're cold and soggy.
We also recommend, if you're going to take some acid, don't take the blue ones, and if you're going to take some, take half a tab first to test it, you know?
For many adults, what happened at Woodstock was the generation gap at its widest. 400,000 young people sat for 3 days in a muddy cow pasture and listened to the amplified beat of rock, and as the beat went on, the drugs came out. The scene overwhelmed the police, who let the mob do its own thing. But the big surprise of Woodstock was that the festival, a model for others like it in 1969, was peaceful, an Aquarian gathering under a cloud of marijuana smoke that drifted up into the wet country air.
What's that spell? What's that spell? What's that spell? What's that spell? What's that spell?
There was personal tragedy in 1969. It happened on the night in July when men were on the verge of landing on the moon.
They had all been out sailing and picnicking and all, and my daughter must have got tired and wanted to go home. And I guess the senator was driving her. I really don't know. I might be saying something that I don't know, but it seems that they were driving home and hit something or going over a little bridge. I don't know. I guess he drowned. I guess the senator almost drowned, but that's all the information I really know.
The mother of Mary Jo Kopechne telling of a call from Senator Edward Kennedy. There had been an accident on Chappaquiddick Island off Martha's Vineyard, and there had been a long delay in reporting it to the police. Senator Kennedy offered his explanation of that night in an address heard across the nation.
There is no truth whatever, to the widely circulated suspicions of immoral conduct that have been leveled at my behavior and hers regarding that evening. There has never been a private relationship between us of any kind, nor was I driving under the influence of liquor. All kinds of scrambled thoughts went through my mind during this period. They were reflected in the various inexplicable, inconsistent, and inconclusive things I said and did, including such questions as whether the girl might still be alive somewhere out of that immediate area, whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys, whether there was some justifiable reason for me to doubt what had happened and to delay my report, whether somehow the awful weight of this incredible incident might in some way pass from my shoulders. I was overcome, I'm frank to say, by a jumble of emotions: grief, fear, doubt, exhaustion, panic, confusion, and shock.
An inquest in 1970 would keep the tragedy at Chappaquiddick in the headlines. There was drama in the skies in 1969.
We've been advised that National 424, a Boeing 727, Key West en route to Miami. At approximately 3:41, the pilot advised there was a kid in the cockpit with a knife, and he was proceeding to Havana. Played a ride.
Eastern
Havana,
Flight 7, a Boeing 727, Newark to Miami nonstop, was hijacked this morning at 10:45 Eastern Time when the flight was 15 miles north of Azalea intersection.
National 44, DC-8, en route from San Francisco to Tampa, was hijacked this morning at 5:31 Eastern Standard Time when the aircraft was 67 miles southwest of Grand Isle, Louisiana.
The story sounded the same as the year before, with one exception.
Friendsville 85 inside, clear to land runway 4 right, wind 100 at 8.
Clear to land was a TWA jet which had been hijacked in the sky between Los Angeles and San Francisco. But instead of landing in Cuba, this one went all the way to Rome. The hijacker, an American Marine named Rafael Minichiello, had pulled off the longest airline heist in history. And after his capture in Rome, he became a local hero. An Italian movie producer announced he would make the story into a movie, starring Sophia Loren as the hostage hostess.
I'm the girl that he had the gun on. I did what he wanted, that's all.
In 1969, the United States Army had its troubles.
They threw us in the stockade just like we were common criminals, and I don't think there's any more dedicated officers in the Army than what we were. And I think we're still pretty damn good soldiers.
In the case of the Green Berets, the Army, the CIA, and top officers of the Special Forces in Vietnam seemed to be involved in spying, counter-spying, and murder. After weeks in confinement, the accused Green Berets were suddenly released, with this word from Army Secretary Stanley Reeser.
I've been advised today that the Central Intelligence Agency, though not directly involved in the alleged incident, has determined that in the interest of national security, it will not make available any of its personnel as witnesses in connection with the pending trials in Vietnam of Army personnel assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group. It is my judgment that under these circumstances, the defendants cannot receive a fair trial. Accordingly, I have directed today that all charges be dismissed immediately.
There was murder at home in 1969. On August 9th, the bodies of actress Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends were found brutally slain in a rented Hollywood house. Miss Tate's husband, film director Roman Polanski, called the press when the police allowed him to return home.
The house is open now, and you can go and see the orgy place. You will see innumerable books about natural birth, which she was planning. You will see the baby clothes. You will see the room, which she was painting. You will see a lot of blood, and that's all.
Before the year of the moon landing was over, the suspected murderers, a band of young nomads, were under arrest and awaiting trial. A trial that began in 1969 was that of the Chicago 8, 8 men accused of conspiracy to incite riots during the Democratic National Convention the year before. At the outset, it was obvious this was to be no ordinary trial.
We have come to Chicago to fight, whether inside the courtroom using all legal means, or whether outside in the streets building the most massive conspiracy this government has ever seen.
When the year ended, the trial was 3 months old and still going strong. The Chicago 8 became a symbol of angry rebellion. But an even bigger story was the Washington 8. The year ended with only 8 men on the Supreme Court. The turn of events had seen Justice Abe Fortas resign under pressure for alleged conflict of interest. Earl Warren retired and was replaced as Chief Justice by Warren Burger. And to bring the court up to full strength, the president appointed Judge Clement Haynesworth of South Carolina.
We oppose Judge Haynesworth because of his resistance to the legitimate aspirations of the black men and women who are equally our brothers and sisters. We oppose Judge Haynesworth because of his record of decisions on labor management cases. We oppose Judge Haynesworth because of his apparent lack of ethical judgment in failing to draw a clear and definite line between his judicial obligations and his personal, financial, and business affairs.
Labor's George Meany and enough others were able to persuade the Senate not to confirm Judge Haynesworth. The judge returned to Washington to visit the president.
No one likes to lose. I don't. But I never have felt that a setback should be accepted as a final defeat of a man or as a judge. So I am going to stay on.
A symphony of French horns, the automobiles of Paris blaring out a welcome to a new French president. In 1969, General Charles de Gaulle resigned to become an ordinary mortal. And in the election which followed, Georges Pompidou became his successor. Across the border in West Germany, there was a new leader as well. Willy Brandt became chancellor. Indeed, the whole face of Europe seemed to be changing. change was evident in Eastern Europe, too. For the first time, an American president was able to pay a state visit behind the Iron Curtain.
I am pleased to extend to you the cordial greeting of the Council of State and of the government, to express the feelings of sympathy of the Romanian people towards the American people, whose contribution to the cause of world progress and civilization is unanimously appreciated in this country.
The purpose of your invitation, Mr. President, and the purpose of my visit here is to improve communications between our two nations. This is a useful and a peaceful purpose.
The trip to Romania climaxed Richard Nixon's second trip abroad in 1969. At one stop on Guam and later in the Philippines, the president proposed what he called the Nixon Doctrine.
Peace is to come from Asia, and I emphasize this point. The United States will play its part and provide its fair share. But peace in Asia cannot come from the United States. It must come from Asia. The people of Asia, the governments of Asia, they are the ones who must lead the way to peace in Asia.
In the year we landed on the moon, the war in Vietnam continued.
From America to Vietnam, I'm fighting a battle to be won. I'm fighting for my country and Uncle Sam. From America to Vietnam. From America to Vietnam.
In Vietnam, there were battles like Hamburger Hill.
Dearest Mom, I'm now on the hill, Hamburger Hill. We had some hot chow yesterday for the first time in a long time. We haven't had any trouble with the gooks lately. Since the 187 lost half of their battalion, I will give you an example if you promise not to worry about me. Company A of the 187th, his lieutenant told me he had 8 men left that still walk around. Well, Mom, I'm closing now. I have to say goodbye. Your son, Nicholas Perry.
In Vietnam, there was Alpha Company, a company that refused to move after being mauled by the enemy. And at home, there was the moratorium. Enough people felt strongly enough about the continuing American involvement that they organized for peaceful protest. At a news conference, the president was asked whether or not the planned demonstrations would influence him.
Under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it.
And then Vice President Agnew joined the fray, and suddenly his name was a household word.
A spirit of national masochism prevails, encouraged by an effete corps of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals. And this country can't afford to be torn to pieces by that kind of demonstrating in the streets.
I'm free to march in the streets. You don't want me to have that street. The morale of the American fighting man in Vietnam has dropped because of people like you. This march got the blessings of the Premier of North Vietnam and the people like you that support the Vietnam. Anybody that supports this is a communist, out and out.
The argument continued with the vice president and with New York Senator Charles Goodell.
Small cadres of professional protesters are allowed to jeopardize the peace efforts of the President of the United States. It's time to question the credentials of their leaders. And if in questioning we disturb a few people, I say it's time for them to be disturbed. And if in challenging we polarize the American people, I say it's time for a positive polarization.
There are some leaders today who, instead of lowering their voices, are raising strident calls to the flag, to patriotism, and against communism. They are even using the age-old device of imputing disloyalty to those in dissent. We say to them, you will not put us off with the divisive, clamorous, pointless rhetoric of yesteryears. We know that the best noisemakers are not necessarily the best peacemakers.
During the campaign of 1968, Richard Nixon claimed to have a plan to end the war in Vietnam. On November 2nd, 1969, more than 8 months after taking office, he revealed it in a nationwide radio and television address.
We have adopted a plan, which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese, for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly, scheduled timetable. And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
1 week later, Vice President Agnew attempted to right a wrong he thought had been dealt his boss.
The audience of 70 million Americans gathered to hear the President of the United States was inherited by a small band of network commentators and self-appointed analysts, the majority of whom expressed in one way or another their hostility to what he had to say. It was obvious that their minds were made up in advance.
The draft law changed in 1969.
Pursuant to the executive order, the Director Selective Service is going to establish tonight a random selection sequence for induction for 1970.
And then the drawing of the first number.
September 14-001.
With that act, much of the nagging uncertainty of the draft was resolved. There was also in 1969 a widening resolve in the country to bring U.S. troops home from Vietnam.
I am announcing tonight a reduction in our troop ceiling of 50,000 more U.S. troops by April 15 next year. This means that the ceiling which existed when I took office on January 20 has now been reduced by 115,500 men.
In 1969, it was said that a massacre of civilians had occurred the year before in the Vietnamese village of My Lai. A soldier who was there told about it.
It was just like any ordinary Vietnamese village. Usually the ones that we go to are women, children, old men. And what was happening is the people were being shot by the members of my company, being rounded up into groups. I saw, at least myself, I saw a group rounded up and fired into, and all the civilians, to my knowledge, there were killed.
Another man who was there, the commanding officer of the company that attacked My Lai, Captain Ernest Medina, had a different point of view.
I did not receive any reports from any of the people that there was a massacre at My Lai 4, that any of them had committed any atrocity at My Lai 4. I did not give any orders to massacre or shoot any women and children.
But for Paul Meadlow, another soldier at My Lai, there was a memory and a hurt that would last the rest of his life.
I stepped on a landmine next day, next morning. I lost a foot out of it. I felt that I was punished for what I'd done the next morning. But later on that day, I felt like I was being punished. Well, at the time, I felt like I was doing the right thing. What I did.
From America to Vietnam, I'm fighting a battle to be won.
The truth of My Lai was another story that would have to wait for 1970. And so in the year we landed on the moon, we were still a country at war.
Vietnam, from America to Vietnam.
In the world of sports, Mickey Mantle retired from the Yankees, and they gave him a day at the stadium.
To think that the Yankees are retiring my number 7 with numbers 3, 4, and 5 tops off everything that I could ever wish for. I've often wondered how a man who knew he was going to die
could stand here and say that he was the luckiest man in the world. But now I think I know how Lou Gehrig felt.
There was another retirement in sports. After leading his underdog New York Jets to a Super Bowl victory, Joe Namath decided he was unwilling to sell his bar, allegedly a gathering place for gamblers. He called a tearful news conference.
I'm innocent. They said I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with anything, but yet, because I'm a football player, I would be suspended for owning a restaurant. I can't go along with that. I've thought about it more than I thought about anything so far that I've ever done. But it's the only right thing to do. And so I am retiring. I'm finished.
But Broadway Joe thought about it, sold his bar, and came back from his exile to play once again for the Jets. 2 men walked on the moon in 1969. A whole team of men walked on air. It happened on the wild night of September 24th.
A double play and it's all over! They're mobbing Gary Gentry! They're mobbing Gary Gentry, the Mets! The fans are pouring out on the field. There's an explosion of paper pouring down on the field as the Mets run to the dugout. The Mets have done it. The Mets have won the first title in their 8-year history. They are the champions of the National League's Eastern Division.
And then, 12 days later, Ralph Kiner described the playoff with the Atlanta Braves.
And the pitch back a curve, chopped out to third. Garrett has the ball, a throw to first. And the Mets are the National League champions. We weren't supposed to do anything this year, but we did it all. Did it all!
Before facing the American League favorites, the Baltimore Orioles, the Mets received a farewell send-off from the mayor of New York, John Lindsay, who, as an underdog himself, won re-election in 1969. After Mayor Lindsay, the Mets did their newfound thing, with Ike Pappas and Steve Young of CBS News reporting the cause and the effect.
When we've got a manager like Gilbert Raymond Hodges, we've got a team that makes up for the Giants and the Dodgers. So good luck down in Baltimore. New Yorkers, place your bets. We know we've got a winner with our amazing Mets.
There's a high drive to deep left field. Jones is under it, and he has it. He has it. The New York Mets have won the World Championship of Baseball. The New York Mets are going absolutely wild on the field. The fans are climbing all over them. They're jumping, leaping.
Police sirens in the background, occasionally a firecracker going off. Huge streamers, 8, 10, 12 stories long.
I've never seen it in my life. It's the first time I've ever seen it. The Knicks did it, the Jets did it, and the Mets did it.
You can actually hear the shuffling through the debris. It's inches thick.
Some final footnotes to 1969. The war in Biafra continued. The cost of living and the crime rate hit all-time peaks. The Supreme Court told school boards, integrate now. Overseas, we entered into arms limitation talks with the Russians. At home, work on an anti-ballistic missile was approved. The Israelis pulled off the Cherbourg caper and brought home 5 gunboats to a tense Middle East. The maxi coat arrived in the streets just as nudity arrived on the stage. It all happened in the year we walked on the moon.
This is my country, land of my choice.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear that I will
General of the Army, Dwight David Eisenhower.
I was overcome, I'm frank to say, by a jumble of emotions, grief, fear, doubt.
We're all in this same puzzle, and we can work it out. We can make it groovy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We oppose Judge Hainsworth because
we know that the best noisemakers are not necessarily the best peacemakers.
An effete corps of impudent snobs who characterize
people being shot by the members of my company.
Our destiny offers not the cup of despair, but the chalice of opportunity. So let us seize it, not in fear, but in gladness. and riders on the earth together, let us go forward, firm in our faith, steadfast in our purpose, cautious of the dangers, but sustained by our confidence in the will of God and the promise of man.
America.